All financial support for this podcast comes from my patrons on patreon.com. If you'd like to join in with the patrons, please check out patreon.com/Darwin Gross. That's DARWIN GROSSE. Now enjoy the podcast. Okay, today I get a chance to speak to somebody who I've been kind of hanging around for a long time. He and I have been social media acquaintances for quite a period of time. Last fall, I got kind of a heads up on some of the work that he had coming down the pipeline. I was very excited about it. Subsequently, he's produced his debut release, an album called Antimatter on Hospital Hill Records. Just the other day was the debut of a film that was done on one of the songs. His name is Ben Carey. He's based out of Sydney, Australia, so while this is early morning coffee time for me, it's evening wine time for him. So I teased him that we're going to be the perfect pairing of a coffee and a wine. I'm loving it. Hey, Ben, how's it going?
Hey, Darwin. How are you?
I'm great. Thanks a lot for taking some of your evening time to have a chat with me.
No problems. It's nice to speak to you.
So why don't we start off by having you, I just dropped a line here on a couple of things that have been going on, but why don't you fill us in a little bit on your kind of the breadth of the work that you're doing right now?
Yeah, totally. Yeah, so I'm an electronic musician. Background is as a saxophone player, and I've been working a lot recently with the modular synthesizer, so I kind of fell pretty hard down that rabbit hole maybe 3 or 4 years ago. I haven't clambered my way back up yet. So I released, as you mentioned, an album, my debut record on Hospital Hill last year, which was a suite of 3 pieces for modular synthesizer. So that's kind of my biggest work to date, but I've also been doing a lot of collaborations. So I've got a duo with an amazing improvising vocalist from here in Sydney who's called Sonya Holowell, and our duo is called Some Conduit. And so that's a completely improvised project where I play the modular synth and she sings, and we don't practice between sets. We've had maybe in the last year and a half, we've played 4 or 5 times, and some of them are quite long plays. One of them was a 2-hour performance. So yeah, we've done a couple of projects recently, and we're gearing up to have a release of a live play. So that's one element of the work that I've been doing that I've been super excited about lately. And also some of the other work that I've been doing has been making my own audio-visual work. So I've been working in Max MSP for a long time doing kind of interactive electronic electroacoustic stuff. But in the last 2 years or so, I've started working with audiovisual media. So a couple of pieces last year that I did for one for modular synthesizer and visuals, and another for a pianist and visuals. So yeah, those kind of things are keeping me busy artistically, and I also teach. So my day job is lucky enough to be a lecturer in composition and music technology at the Sydney Conservatorium of Music. So I'm teaching undergrads and postgrads composition, electronic music, music production, and installations and things of that sort. So yeah, that's kind of in a nutshell what I've been up to of late.
Sure, that's pretty interesting. So you're sort of the first teacher I've really gotten a chance to talk to since a lot of the COVID stuff has hit hard. Right. What is the teaching? How is that going for you? Is that as tough as it seems?
Yeah, I mean, look, right now you've caught me at a good time because we're kind of coming up towards the end of our semester here. So our academic year in Australia goes from the start of the calendar year until the end of the calendar year. So we're at the end of our first semester. And when it all hit, we're probably at the start of our 4th week of semester. And that was a real challenge at my uni in particular, because we basically had overnight to change all of our subjects to online delivery. And it's been a real challenge, I think, just juggling that with just day-to-day living, okay. Having a toddler and my wife's working full time from home as well. So all of those kinds of things have been challenging. But in terms of the teaching, I think getting over that initial hurdle of the first 4 weeks. Now it's actually quite smooth sailing. The online teaching doesn't have as many glitches anymore in terms of engaging with the students. The students seem to be used to it now, but I find, I don't know if anyone else who's been doing teaching online has found this, but I found it quite tiring to engage with a class continuously, because you kind of feed off the class's energy in real life.
Right.
And in a video chat where you've got 20 other little boxes on the screen, and some of them have video, some of them have got video on, some of them don't. You make a dumb joke and no one laughs, and that's usually what happens. But in in class, you can at least read the room, but online it's a little tricky. So yeah, I mean, look, in this situation, complaining about those things is a bit silly, given the upheaval that everyone in the world is going through, and I think particularly artists and musicians are doing it really tough. So I count myself very lucky to have a job, and even if there are some challenging things about the teaching, it's it's something that I can get through. Yeah.
That's actually a really great point, and I have to make sure that I don't forget that there's an awful lot of luck in all of this for me and for others who are able to continue to work when at a time when musicians and artists are just going to really have a rough time of it. So
absolutely,
that's a great point. One of the things I would say though is, much like we're all lucky for having the opportunities that Skype and Zoom and some of these other things bring for being able to do off or online classes, I also think it's kind of good that music technology went that way too, because it would be really hard to teach tape splicing, for example.
Oh my God, yeah.
In this kind of situation, right? The virtualization of the studio kind of is handy right now.
Oh yeah, no, totally. It's funny. I've been chatting with a few colleagues about this, and although we've been bitching and moaning about the best way to stream your audio through Zoom so that you can get it in stereo, or the students can get the best quality or whatever. Some of the subjects that some of my colleagues are trying to organize online, like chamber music subjects where you've got ensembles.
Yeah.
And orchestral studies, or even instrumental lessons over Skype. I've got so many friends that are teaching instrumental lessons, and there's so much in that personal connection in a room with someone that you just can't do online. So yeah, music tech, or getting over the hurdles of the screen sharing and the sound and stuff aside, it actually does work. So we're lucky in that way. Yeah.
Yeah. So true. Now, one of the things I'm curious about a little bit is this release, the antimatter release on Hospital Hill. You said that came out last year. That was like November or so, right?
Yeah.
That's your debut album, although that kind of surprised me because you have been performing and doing collaborations and stuff for a long time. What spurred you into doing a solo record now?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, look, I'm calling it a debut record in the sense that it's something that's really the first release of mine, which I can really kind of stamp as my own and just fully my work, performing and composing, kind of improvising this stuff. So my work prior to Antimatter, which is all Eurorack modular pieces, was working on a piece of software called Derivations, which was an interactive system that I developed around kind of 2013, 2014. And so I do have actually a release from that time, but it was very collaborative, which was the nature of the software. So I designed this software that instrumental improvisers could perform with. And the Derivations release was 6. It was kind of like an EP length, a bit over half an hour, 6 performances with that software. So I think, yeah, I mean, it's been a while between drinks. That was 2014 when I put that out, and so now it's it was at the end of 2019 I put out Antimatter. I just felt that I had 2-3 years really diving very deep into this new practice, which was the modular synth practice, and it was time to do something of my own. And I'd been performing a little bit, and it just felt like the right time. So I guess that's how it came to be. Yeah.
Sure, that makes a lot of sense. I'm going to want to dive into that a little bit more in a few minutes.
Totally. Yep.
First, one of the things I like doing on my podcast is learning more about how people got to be the artists that they are. I am curious about your background because, first of all, you mentioned right at the top that you're a saxophonist, and then you never mentioned saxophone again. So there's that.
Yeah.
But also how saxophone, a lot of times people don't really think of that as being sort of like the center of the universe for like how people are going to get into music technology.
No,
And
absolutely.
so I'm curious where the technology part slid into play and how all this melded into sort of like the stuff that is you.
So no, you're right, and it's kind of interesting. Like I've been describing myself as a saxophone player for a long time, and it really is kind of the core of my musical being, if you like. It's the thing that I studied for the longest amount of time, and it's the instrument that I've spent the most time on. But I haven't played the saxophone seriously for a while now. So I started playing the sax, like a lot of people do, in what you would call elementary school. So I would have been 9. I've got a twin brother actually, and my mother was a music teacher, and she taught at a school which had a very, very small music program, and they had 2 spare instruments there, and one was a clarinet and one was a saxophone, and she just kind of put them in front of us, and we both reached for one of the instruments each, and that's kind of how. And there was no fight, which is interesting because with twins we fought all the time. But yeah, I mean, I started the saxophone at that point. But before that, I'd played guitar. My father was a frustrated classical guitarist, and we started that when I was really young. But I went through doing grades. I actually learned the saxophone in a classical way. So I'm actually a classically trained saxophonist. I didn't learn jazz. I didn't have really any interest in jazz. And the history of the classical saxophone is an interesting one. It's got a very, it's a young instrument in general. It was only invented in 1840. And so in terms of classical repertoire, it doesn't take long until you get to the realms of looking at new music or avant-garde kind of 20th century.
Modern music, yeah, right.
Exactly.
I always kind of joke with people when they talk about music technology and stuff in music schools. I'm like, in a lot of music schools, they're still sort of like fighting about whether a saxophone's a real instrument or not.
Oh, exactly. Yeah. That's exactly right. And I think, look, from the perspective of someone who did so much classical saxophone playing, that's still something that a lot of us classical saxophone players have had to deal with. Right. Yes, there's a couple of pieces in the orchestra, but we do have other repertoire. Right. But yeah, it was kind of limited in a way. But I mean, look, I played it all the way through high school. I did my undergrad degree doing classical sax. I went overseas. I spent 2 years studying in Bordeaux in France over there. And the main thing that actually drew me to studying in France was kind of by the time I was about 20, I was really heavily into modern music, into kind of contemporary classical music. And most of my friends were composers. And when I studied in France, I chose a particular teacher over there because that was her bag. And she ran a contemporary music class. And she also had a contemporary music ensemble, which called Proxima Centauri Ensemble. And as part of that, they had a dedicated electronics performer who's her husband, Christophe Havel. And so that side of things all started around that time. So this would have been for me 2007. And I'd already started improvising on my sax, kind of free improvisation, exploring a little bit of technology using Ableton, doing some feedback stuff, a bit of live looping, that kind of thing. And by the time I got to France, I was still interpreting pretty hardcore contemporary classical music, but I was also learning to program in PD and Max at night because I was really interested in the electronic side of things. So yeah, that's where it all really started. It was, I guess, from this kind of contemporary classical angle and free improvised angle that allowed me to get interested in working with music tech, and then I fell down the programming Max MSP interactive angle pretty soon after that.
Sure. Well, it's also interesting though, because I think a lot of people, when they hear about somebody who is a saxophonist and works primarily in improvisation, their immediate assumption is that you're coming from a jazz repertoire, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
And so it's kind of interesting to hear that you're coming very much from the avant-garde classical side instead. Does that ever kind of get you in hot water or put you in positions where people make assumptions just because you got a saxophone on your neck?
There have been times, yeah, but I think it depends. For me, the scene here in Sydney, before I left Sydney to go to study in France, so this is between finishing my undergrad and moving to do some study in Bordeaux, there was this really open, and there still is, improvised music scene in Sydney where people came from a whole bunch of different backgrounds and were playing free improv and always involving some form of electronics as well. So I saw people that had a whole bunch of different backgrounds playing many different types of instruments, and there wasn't necessarily this, for me, it didn't seem like this divide between a jazz background or a classical background or a free improv kind of pedigree, if you like. There was, it was just music making. And that was as someone who'd gone through a conservatorium system and learnt classically for many years, that was super liberating. And yeah, I think that I kind of kept that in the back of my mind before I did more study. And I'd always been in an environment where I guess the saxophone that I played, the kind of saxophone that I played, was accepted, I guess. And we've also got a really strong new music scene in Sydney as well. So
that's really cool. Now, what was the thing that broke you into scene? Because Sydney's no small town. It's not like It's not like you kind of like walk into town and say, "Here I am," and everybody salutes, right? What did it take to break into the scene there? Was it through going to school in Sydney, or were there people there that kind of like opened the door for you to work with them? How did that happen?
Yeah, I mean, look, when I started going to improv gigs, kind of around 2005, 2006. I'd actually finished studying, and initially my thought was, I'm going to jump straight overseas straight away. I need to continue, my practice. I need to, keep studying, get my skills up. But one thing that really excited me with it was actually just not studying for a bit, and just being in the world a little bit. And so I did know some people from my studies, composers that had been interested in improvised music, and friends of friends as well of theirs who were musicians in the scene. So I got a good friend who's a kind of a noise vocalist and artist, Kasum Normoil, who she lives in Australia but has done a lot of work overseas. Very high intensity feedback based noise vocals, and she was a friend of a friend at the time we started collaborating with a guitarist and composer friend of mine, Lachlan Colquhoun. And so, yeah, we got our first gig at a little series in Sydney. And then I started to go to these kind of regularly over the next year and just got to know people in the scene. And interestingly then, as soon as I really started getting interested in improvised music and that scene, that was the time that I did jump overseas. And so I lost touch with a lot of people and went on a different route, but have kind of rediscovered that since coming back and spending many years back in Sydney. But yeah, I think it's just one of those things, you just sniff it out.
Right.
It is a big city, but this kind of music making is, there's still small pockets.
Well, I think there's something to that. If you go and you go to the gigs and you show interest and you show a connection to the music and stuff, people are going to notice you. They're going to notice your face in the crowd or whatever. So that probably helps. Now, the other thing I would say though is that you are very comfortable working in collaboration, right? You've had a number of collaborations with people like Zubin Kanga. And the thing you were talking about with Sonya Holowell, the duet that you have a release coming up with, but and this person that you just kind of kicked off your career with, it's when I look back at your body of work, what I see is an awful lot of collaboration stuff. I think that helps open doors. But I'm curious to hear from you. What is it about collaboration that particularly works for you? Because clearly it must.
Well, it does, absolutely. I mean, I think it's super important to me. And one thing that I've noticed, particularly over the last maybe over the last 10 years or so, is that the space that I work best in a collaborative environment is usually in a duo format. And there's something really special about a duo format because the well, from a practical standpoint, there's only two positions on whatever it is that you're trying to achieve, and so
doesn't have to be much of a democracy, right?
No, well, there you go, exactly. And I think in that respect, it really, whether or not we're talking about just collaborating on stage, in terms of an improvised duo. And there's not much talk around it, and you just get on stage and collaborate. Or we're talking about longer form things where you're working with someone on a release or whatever it is, or a tour or whatever it may be. I found that that's a real sweet spot for me, just working with one other person that you can build a relationship with over a long time, and that you trust. And you feel like you're heard as much as they feel like they're heard. So I think, so for me, like a couple of these collaborations have been really special to me. So for instance, Zubin Kanga, you mentioned before, he's a pianist, amazing new music pianist that's from Australia, but is now based in London and comes back very regularly, works with an ensemble here in Sydney called Ensemble Offspring. And so Zubin and I have been working together for a long time. I'm not sure how many years now, but we kind of got in contact originally because Zubin, he's had this project for working with piano and multimedia, which is an ongoing thing. And he usually does a very large Australian tour every 2 years, commissioning a number of works for piano and video, electronics, these kinds of things. And so I was brought on in the project as I guess you would say, the kind of live electronics performer / technical assistant. And I've also written a piece for him and also had him perform with some of my software before, and collaborated creating software for other composers and these kinds of things. And that's been a incredibly fulfilling relationship because it's got a balance of a whole bunch of different elements. I mean, I really like Zubin. I really get along with the guy. But also the projects that he brings me are really interesting, often things that I might not have thought of artistically as interesting from the outset. But when you get into the real nitty-gritty of the program, they're always really beautifully thought out. He's got a real intense passion for collaboration with many different composers. And also, I think he's someone that's really loyal. So when he finds someone that he wants to work with for a long time, he continues working with that person. I think I've learned in a way that that's something that I really like about collaboration as well. You just, you get to see projects through for a long time and continually work with that person, and you develop your art together. I think that's really special. So Zubin, that's been a beautiful collaboration. Another person that I work with a lot is actually Matthew McGuigan, who you mentioned at the top made this film Surfacing with me recently, and he is Hospital Hill, which is the label that my release came out of. And so we work together in the guise of me being artist on the label, also me doing a lot of kind of electronics performing and technical assistant work in performances that he might be filming or recording himself, as well as doing these kind of filmed collaborations. And again, we just always find ourselves working with each other. Even if it's not planned, someone books him for film and books me for sound or whatever it is. Awesome. You just get to know someone whose work is really top notch, and you also get along with them as a person. Why wouldn't you work with them again? I think that's
sure. That makes a lot of sense. Well, as long as we're talking about Matthew, let's talk a little bit more about that video, because that was really impressive. It just debuted the other night, and it got a lot of attention on social media. It's a really neat film because it's sort of, it puts you at the heart of the performance. Basically, you're sitting in the middle of an empty warehouse, but by manipulating the visuals and by playing around with editing and stuff like that, Matthew developed a really interesting visual connection to your work, which was cool.
Yeah.
But also, it kind of showed what your work looks like. And I would say that it was interesting for me because having heard your work and then seeing you perform, it was like, oh, okay, I get it. Right? There was a connection to like what I hear and what you're doing. And it's interesting, especially because first of all, you have in addition to a modestly and greatly patched up modular system, you have a reel-to-reel tape deck that you're using as a great big tape loop. So you have kind of the historically accurate long piece of tape with a with a microphone stand holding it up, right? Which is
couldn't
cool.
be anything else but a mic stand.
That's right. I mean, it was good enough for the Beatles. It's got to be good for you too, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
But also the thing that kind of caught my attention was, I don't know if you had it mic'd or if you had sensors or what, but some of your playing was like rapping on the case for your modular or popping the case on the tape deck, and it added something really particular and really, I think, crucial to that performance, which was this sense of the live playback, right? The sense of you being physically engaged with the sound in a way that no one ever is going to get if what you're doing is twiddling a few knobs.
Sure.
Can you talk a little bit about, first of all, what's going on there that allows that to happen? And secondly, why you chose these really physical additions to a modular execution?
Yeah, great questions. I mean, so I might kind of track back to the concept of the video. I mean, Matt had this beautiful concept, which was, as you said, we were filmed. I was filmed playing this improvisation in this really open warehouse, and Matt had a really singular vision about the way it would look. He said, "Okay, well, we'll set up in the afternoon, and the idea is that we would do the same performance at least 3 times at 3 different times in the afternoon, evening, and in that way." Without touching the 3 camera angles. So he made sure that all the cameras had just enough battery to be able to do the number of hours of filming that we had to do, so that he didn't even need to bump them a millimeter. He could do some splicing between different lighting states. And from in my mind's eye, before I went and actually, developed the patch and thought about what I was going to perform in the space, I thought, okay, this will be nice. There'll be a few different lighting states, and he might, slowly fade from one to the other, that kind of thing. And, little did I know that he would do the kind of detailed, beautiful editing that he did. I mean, there's times that certain gestures that I do on the instrument, make a light flicker that wasn't happening because he's jumping between lighting states, and gorgeous stuff. So in terms of the actual physical performance, when I perform on the modular, I have kind of 2 ways of engaging with the modular, and one is a studio practice and one is a live practice. And I found particularly in the last year, I started to work out why I have these 2 different modes. So one thing that I'm super interested in when I'm working in the studio is trying to develop really complex generative patches, right? So things that play themselves. I work a lot with feedback. I work a lot with kind of these patches that so many different parts of the patch are contingent on each other, and I only need to touch certain things for them to kind of bloom into different spaces. And that works perfectly in the studio for me. And I think it's something about sitting in a modular for a long time and just having it play back at you, which is a very solitary, interesting experience to have. But I'm not as interested in that, getting on stage and doing that, because as someone that's always stood on stage with an instrument, and I'm quite a physical performer when I play with the saxophone, there's just something, I've never really analyzed it, but it doesn't feel right not moving much when I play the modular as an instrument. And so the kinds of things that you're talking about on the tape machine, I just had a contact mic strapped to it.
All right.
And I had that fed through a preamplifier that was going into the modular, and every now and again I would just turn that channel on, which would allow me to tap the body of the tape player, which would give these kind of percussive sounds. It's also interesting because this reel-to-reel is just a consumer thing from 1968. It's a tube thing and it's noisy as hell. And so what I've done sometimes is just put a contact mic on, and it has this kind of whirring mechanical noise
Sure.
to it. So I feed that in often. I'll process that through other things like the morphogene to get some kind of, granular goodness out of it, maybe through other filters and things like that. But yeah, in terms of the physicality, that was just something percussive to have. And the case, I have actually noticed that it was maybe a couple of years ago, I saw a couple of performances by, I'm going to say his name wrong, but the Chinese builder and performer Men Qi. I'm not sure if you know his stuff.
Yeah, I do.
Amazing modules, beautiful design. But his performances, I noticed there are a couple of performances that I saw him do where he was using just a skiff, like a 3U skiff, and he was tapping the case, and I was thinking, what is making that sound? And I realized that he had something, it must have been either the microphony or the
ears,
mutable instruments, the ears, exactly.
Yeah.
Fed into some kind of resonator, and that kind of stuck in the back of my mind. And I've got the ears in my case and are U-rings, so the nano version of the mutable instruments rings.
Mm-hmm.
And so when you crank up the gain on the preamplifier that's driving the contact mic, you can actually make the entire case microphone. And so feeding that into the input of a physical modeling module like the rings means that I can use the tapping of the case as if I'm actually tapping a percussion instrument. So I like doing that because it I can then throw that to a reverb or a delay or something and then go and do something else. And often that's what you see me doing in that particular film, is that I'm tapping it to get these kind of string-like resonances, and then I go and do something else as that decays. So it becomes quite percussive as well as gestural.
Well, that also seems like a great tool for doing some transitioning, because let's face it, what a lot of people end up doing for translations is they have a radio music or something where they just play a pre-recorded thing that like gets them from one section to another. This really seems like a neat way to be able to transition from one sort of section to another. I like it.
Yeah, really cool. Kind of big resonances. Another thing that I have in that patch, actually, I don't know if you know the company Landscape. They do the stereo field. It's this weird feedback device, and a couple of other things that are like hand crank tape players. Anyway, they've also made these tiny little kind of contact points. They're called the All Flesh. So they're literally just an open circuit that you just plug in, and they're a tiny little touch pads, almost like the pressure points touch pads, but even smaller. And you can put them on any point in your case, and then you can say you've got a noise source coming out of one, and then you put your finger on another one, which is going into a filter. Putting your finger on two pads actually creates a connection through your body as if you're patching a patch cable.
So you're literally the wire.
Yeah. So there's this interesting kind of performative routing that I like doing. I haven't done it in a while, but for that piece I did that. Yeah.
That's interesting. Well, also the other thing is, though, having the great big tape thing, one of the things that caught my attention is you have the great big tape thing, but I realized watching that piece, every other time when I see a live performer working with a long piece of tape, the long piece of tape is the primary instrument, and everything else is serving the tape. That didn't seem to be the case here. In fact, in most instances, I wasn't even really noticing the delay time or the delay coming back. What was, for you, from your standpoint, first of all, why did you feel like you needed to have the tape loop? And secondly, what was sort of like the musical purpose for it within the piece?
So the tape loop, I haven't actually used with the reel-to-reel. I haven't yet used the reel-to-reel as a live looping device. Okay. So that was actually a pre-recorded tape loop that I was processing through the patch. So I was using the kind of flicking the tape's speed switch to get these. Kind of hear a couple of times these glissandi up an octave and glissando down an octave, these kinds of things, and also just processing that through the morphogene in time lag accumulation mode, which is that mode where you can use it as a real time sampler, sound on sound kind of thing. So weirdly, using a pre-recorded loop and then processing it digitally in the way that I would do if I had
if you had a tape loop. That's hilarious. That's funny.
yeah.
That's awesome.
I mean, yeah. So I mean, recording the loop that I did on, I used the same patch that I was performing on to create a bed of sounds to put on the tape loop, and this one's kind of cruddy, right? Like the recording onto those tapes, and they were the tapes that I was given when I bought this thing secondhand. I don't think, I think they're original from the 1970s or something. So they're old tapes, and recording onto them, you get these dropouts. It's very gritty, and I was really interested in that sound, I guess.
Sure.
And then processing that, it just gave a particular character, I guess, to it. So yeah. And that's how I used the tape. I guess it's just something that every now and again I would bring in as a texture, and there was something quite nice about having that physicality of it there, and knowing that, in the modular you've always got things underneath the surface that might be bubbling away that you can bring up and then bring back down, and that was just a nice physical thing that was there doing the same, serving the same purpose. And I was just mixing it in using the modular mixer.
Sure, that makes a lot of sense. So I'm curious a little bit, because you talked a lot about how you got to where you are, but what you didn't do is really crack the door open on why modular and how you got snaked into that. Now, my assumption is, having when you were in France and working with Max MSP and PD, that kind of opened your head to the idea of modular stuff. But what was it that made you make the leap into hardware?
So I kind of started doing the Max stuff first, way back in France, and then I really spent a lot of time basically exclusively working in Max. And so you're right, I think that did give me an appreciation for a modular way of thinking. But I started getting interested in hardware when I was building little Max for Live devices and creating these kind of generative sets, if you like, or generative pieces using interlocking Max for Live devices. And it was around, I can't remember what year it was, but maybe it was 4 or 5 years ago, that company Max for Cats came out with Ocelot.
Yes.
Which is a Max for Live based software modular. And it was around that time, as well as Beep coming out in Max. I can't remember if it was Max. Was it Max 7 that Beep came out?
I think so, yeah.
Yeah. So I think it was starting to creep in as a possibility. The actual, I guess, working with software emulations of modular, and then I started doing some research. And I have a friend, the same friend that I initially hooked up with to do improvised stuff way back in 2006, and he'd been thinking about building a modular system for a long time. And just kind of dreaming about it, and constantly on a site that I'd never heard of, which was called Muff Wiggler. And so this was kind of in my consciousness. So the first piece of hardware that I bought, I think, must have been a Me Blip, which was, that little, it's kind of like a little digital with analog filter thing, and it was just starting to think about getting sound out of my computer into hardware devices. Okay. And then I played with these things called patch blocks, which was there were these tiny little devices, battery powered devices that you would connect together, but they had a PD-like interface which would allow you to code your own effects and things on them. And there was something like really magical for me about being able to code something generative or even something performative, but then use hardware on it, like, actually use your hands. Right. I thought that was quite nice. And then, I bought the Moog Mother 32 when that came out, and then an MS-20 Mini, and then I just thought, okay, it's probably time.
It's game over, right?
It's game over. I said to myself, though, when I first bought a skiff, I thought, okay, I'm just going to get a 3U and that'll just supplement the things I'm doing in Max. I've got Mo 2, I've got DC coupled outputs. I can control the thing with my computer, and that'll be fine. And then as soon as I got the 3U, I realized I needed a 6U, and then it was all over. So, and now I work with a 12U system, which my rule of thumb is if I need to buy something, I have to sell something.
Right.
So that's kind of, yeah. And I think, I mean, look, that was a long-winded way of saying, I think now, all of those things were the things that got me into modular. But now what I love about it is I don't have to look at a screen. I can really engage with my hands. I can think about really interesting connections between different elements, between the gestural side of things and the generative side of things, without having to code, without having to deal with software updates and things like that. But it has its own problems, that's for sure.
Yeah, well, one of the things I was going to ask, because as a person who is not only are you a self-described composer, but you freaking teach composition, right?
Yeah.
It would strike me that you are not going to be satisfied with an 8-step loop that goes forever, and then you kind of tweak the FM and filter settings, right?
Yep.
Your expectation is going to be to have a system that can provide you support for your compositional vision in some useful way. What is it that you do that specifically affords that?
In a modular system, to me?
Yes, in a modular system, right? Because generally speaking, modular systems are great for sound design and can be great for certain kinds of performance. But, again, thinking about your background and where you're coming from, the expectation is you're going to be bringing a lot of complexity compositionally to the table. And that isn't necessarily the easy path in a modular system.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, I think I've been gravitating very, very much towards, since the start of developing the modular system, exactly what you say, complexity, and also, I guess, although these kind of divides of East Coast, West Coast are largely in the Eurorack system kind of meaningless, because we all have blended systems. But I guess I'm kind of been, I guess, erring towards the side of the West Coast side of things for a while, because of things like random sources, things like working with envelope generators as not just as plucking a filter or a VCA, but of ways of generating sounds over time. Some of the things that I really value in a modular system, although I like digital modules, is the one knob per function stuff, things that make me think. So I've been kind of wrestling with this idea of the patching process as compositional in a way, and this weird space between when you're developing a patch, especially when you're developing a patch that you then will perform with. It kind of feels like you're setting the scene for some kind of navigation of an environment, and I like to develop really complex systems that can interlock with each other, or I can bring in or bring out. But I like to think of, like, when you're actually patching, that's a form of composition, and it's a score in a way that, like a graphic score is to me, that it's something that but also kind of feeds back to you. Do you know what I mean? So you're interacting with something that you've developed, but what you've developed isn't fully your own. It's something that you have to contend with surprises, and I like setting up surprises that may not be simply just using sample and hold on a noise source to give you all possible values, but doing really complex interlocking things that might on the surface seem like they're simple, but in aggregate, when they start to bubble up from the ground up, you can't actually predict where they're going to go. So you have to pilot a patch. So yeah, one thing that's been quite recent, maybe in the last 6 months, is a real love for the Serge workflow. And I was lucky enough to spend some time down at the Melbourne Electronic Sound Studio, which is this incredible playground of synthesizers down in Melbourne in Australia. And they have a 12-panel Paperface Serge system from 1973, I believe, down there. And I did a little residency down there for 4 days. And I mean, that thing doesn't give you anything. You have to work for work for everything you get out of it. So I think there's something about cultivating technique that comes maybe from being a player of an instrument, comes maybe from, you know, someone that spent a lot of time in a little box practicing tiny little things, that actually spending time learning the intricacies of an instrument like this, gets my synapses firing. I like working out problems, I think, and there's a link to max programming as well with that, I reckon.
Sure. Well, I think it's clear that the Serge made an impression on you, because anyone that goes to bencarey.net will immediately be presented with an image of you in front of that big Paperface system. Yeah, but it's interesting, because looking at that, I realize to what extent the company 7375 has really put some effort into kind of putting those modules out again. And I'm wondering if you have any inclination to try and move in that direction for your work, or was it a nice flavor but not necessarily your main meal?
Yeah, Darwin, I have a 7375 home built sitting in front of me.
Oh, you do? Okay. Well, there you go. So that answers my question right there.
Yeah, it was, I left mess and I immediately started looking into how can I get this in my home. Right. And I must thank my work for allowing me to do that. I'm very privileged that I work at a university where part of my a lot of my work is research, creative work and research, and so I am allowed to apply for funding for certain things, and I was lucky enough to apply for some funding for this Serge system. So I've been diving into that a lot and working with feedback on this thing. It's kind of interesting. Jumping from that enormous 12-panel system down to a much more stripped back 2-panel system. And it's been really nice kind of working with that limitation, because, I think working with limitations brings out a lot creatively, personally.
Sure.
So, yeah.
Well, that's incredible. I'm going to want to learn more, but we'll actually save that for later. Unfortunately, our time is up, and so we need to wrap it up. But before I let you go, what do you have on the workbench that might be coming out soon?
Yeah, sure. So super excited that I've got this this collaboration with Sonya Holowell. The Some Conduit is our project. So it's the duo, the voice and modular synth duo. So we've got an album that we're going to release in a couple of weeks' time. We're just kind of putting all kind of lining up all the ducks and trying to get everything rolling for that. So that was a play that we did last year in October, a 55-minute performance that we recorded on site. And we're releasing that, and the album name is Track. So that's going to be in a couple of weeks. With the same duo, we did kind of a really beautiful project the other week, also working with Matt McGuigan, where the Art Gallery of New South Wales invited us in to do a performance in front of a really large canvas. They've got this series at the moment during lockdown, which is called Together in Art, where they're inviting artists, musicians to come in and play in the lockdown empty gallery.
Okay.
So it's been a really lovely series, and Matt's been doing all the films for them, and they're just gorgeous. So we did an improvised performance in front of a really large canvas by an American artist called Mark Bradford. And so that's coming out soon, another Matt McGuigan video. And I'm still sifting through material recorded at my MESS residency last year. I'm hoping to do a release of Serge material within the next year, hopefully. And always working on modular stuff. I've done a couple of live streams during lockdown, which has been a lot of fun. So I might see if I can do another one or two soon. But yeah, just looking forward to wrapping up the semester and getting a bit more time to do creative work and research. I've got a couple of research projects at work on the boil that need some time to work on. So yeah, that's what I'll be up to in the next little bit.
Well, that sounds fantastic. Well, Ben, I want to thank you for taking the time out of your evening to have this discussion with me. I hope that I'm going to give you a chance now to get back to your bottle of wine to take care of work this evening. But thank you so much for sharing the information and filling in a lot of blanks on how you do what you do. Is really, really interesting.
I appreciate it, Darwin, and thanks so much for getting up early and giving us a call, and thanks for the invite. Really nice to chat.
Yeah, likewise. Okay, well, with that, I'm going to let you go. Have a good one.
You too. Take care.
Bye.
Bye.
Many thanks to Ben for having the great chat. It was really awesome to learn more about how he does his stuff. If you haven't seen the Surfacing film, there's going to be a link in the show notes. But additionally, that he talked about the Some Conduit group. It's himself and Sonya Holowell. You're going to want to check this thing out. It's really unique. It's positioned in a cool way where you've got a vocalist and a modular synth person. It's not a combination we see very often. So checking it out would probably be worth your while. You can get over to the show notes. You can look at someconduit.com. That's SUMNCONDUIT.com. They just had a release just this week, and it's out there on Bandcamp as well. So I will have links for that all in the show notes. Please check it out. It's worth the listen. Ben's Antimatter release is also available on Bandcamp. And the Surfacing film that we talk about is available through a link on the website as well. So we'll get you set up one way or the other. A lot of this stuff can just be gotten to from bencarey.net. I want to thank you all for listening. I want to thank you for continuing to support me and the podcast. Those of you who are patrons over on patreon.com, that's patreon.com/DarwinGross. I want to thank you so much for your help. And I also want to say hi to all the people that were at the workshop yesterday at the Music Hack Space in London, the virtual workshop. I had a great time, and I hope that you did too. And I hope that if there's any questions, you'll reach out and contact me. And that kind of goes for everybody. If you have any questions, comments, concerns, please drop me a line. ddg@cycling74.com, darwin.gross@gmail.com, or ddg@20objects.com. It'll all hit me. Thanks a lot, and we will catch you next time around. Bye.